Bettina Arndt is a writer and social commentator and also an online dating consultant who writes for many of Australia's leading newspapers and magazines and who appears regularly on television and radio. Her latest book, What Men Want, follows on from her recent international bestseller, The Sex Diaries.
Okay, I think I'm here for light relief between all this data you're being presented with tonight. And I'm mainly going to be talking about my experience writing about these issues over the last pretty much 30 years and trying to talk about them and have people start a proper discussion about them, relatively unsuccessfully, I feel. A few years ago, I had a particularly horrible day. I got off a plane from America with my son, who ended up with this dreadful headache, and we spent the whole day in emergency trying to find out what was going on. And luckily, it turned out not to be a big deal, but I'm staggering out of St Vincent's at midnight, and I'm walking next to a woman who came up to me and said, "You've become so conservative." And I ended up talking to her for an hour in the car park. Really interesting, because she was a woman who, she finally told me that she was really angry at me because I've been writing about the impact of divorce on children. And she explained in the end that she had had 2 marriages, which both broken up. And she said that her children actually had some of them had a particularly hard time. But what was interesting is she said she hated reading about the impact of divorce on children and the fact that children can have all these problems. And she didn't want to hear it, and she particularly didn't want to hear it from me, because I was a person back in the 70s who'd been her hero, writing about everyone going out and having a good time in bed. And the last person she wanted to talk about when it came to the whole issue of parents and their responsibilities to children was me. And it was a very interesting experience for me, this particular animosity I attracted there. And it's something I've come across a lot. Media Watch some years ago used to have this little item called Reptile of the Week. And once I was Reptile of the Week, simply, not because I'd done anything ghastly in terms of plagiarism or anything, simply because I was writing about divorce and children. Miss Porn has become Miss Prim, telling us how to live our lives. So there is a real antagonism to discussion around this sort of issue. And yet I've had no question. This has been one of the issues that have really interested me most over these many years of journalism. I feel this is the big story when it comes to looking at what's happened to children, resulting in more children being raised in poverty, in more children having a whole range of behavioural problems in schools, children having lesser lives essentially, and no one wants to talk about it. Some of you may remember, back in the 1980s, Bob Hawke made a promise, an election promise, saying that no child would live in poverty by 1990. Really interesting looking to see why that didn't happen. As Patrick stated, he showed a graph that I think spelt this out very interestingly. Unfortunately for Bob Hawke, that era, the 1990s, was the time when the family patterns we've been talking about tonight really started kicking in. A 70% increase in ex-nuptial birth rate during that decade. And by that end of that decade, 1 in 4 children were being born out of wedlock. And there's no question this is why Bob Hawke didn't manage to pull that off. Bob Gregory, you may know, very well known as economist at the ANU, he did a lot of work at one point showing that the link to the rise in jobless families. And it was all about this increase in the number of children being born to single mothers and the changes in the traditional family structure. And yet, so Bob was one of the few academics who've really gone out and tried to talk about this. And he too got very little response to his work. It's interesting when you talk about this issue of jobless families, of children being raised in poverty, the answer that always comes out from the media is, well, we have to give them more money. The problem would be solved if we provided more, an increase in the sole parent pension and so on. And in actual fact, obviously poverty is part of the problem, that it's very hard to support a child and to look after a child while you're going out and earning money. And a lot of people have great difficulty with that. But they've done really careful work in America, teasing out what's going on here. And the factors that determine this lesser life for children, the problems that are developing in single-parent homes for children, are not just to do with poverty. They've actually isolated out other factors, such as the fact that, one parent means less supervision, which means one parent being really stretched to provide the attention and care children need in order to thrive. And of course, there's also really good research showing at what fathers contribute to children's development. And the fact that fathers actually teach children things that many mothers don't, teach them to take risks, teach them to play in a certain way. Steve Biddulph, for instance, writes very well about this, talking about the fact that the roughhousing, the wrestling that many dads do with their children, and particularly with their boys, teaches boys constraint, teaches them how to control their anger in situations that can easily lead on to violence. And there's really interesting research around that as well. Last year, a report came out from the Brookings Institute in America called Not Yet, looking at the changing marriage patterns and particularly looking at the increasing age before the average marriage age, so more and more delay in getting married. But one of the things they point out, which is really interesting, is there's now a real gap emerging in terms of education. So the better educated people here and in America still tend to delay marriage for a long time, but they still tend to marry and then have their children. And so that's at the top end. And the lower educated community, there's a totally different pattern emerging. Marriage has gone out the window, more and more single mothers, more and more people having children in de facto families. And as they point out, it is increasing the gaps between the haves and the have-nots, because it is increasing stability for the delay in marrying, is increasing stability for well-educated families, and the families that need that stability most aren't getting it. And yet, you look at this evidence, this accumulating this evidence you're seeing tonight, it is never discussed on our major policy, current affair programs. If you look at the 730 report, I don't think they've ever discussed this issue at all, Four Corners, you name it. And it's one of the things I've always sort of puzzled, what's going on here. One of the problems we have is we have a lot of people now who've been raised by single parents, single mums, and they always wanted to say, my mum did a great job. Look at me, there's nothing wrong with me. How can there be a broad problem in this area? Because of their own experience, and their mums may have done, indeed, a heroic job raising them. But, to deny that there are any problem patterns emerging here is nonsensical. It's like saying just because we find a 90-year-old who's smoking a pack a day who's still alive, that means that the link between smoking and ill health doesn't stand up. I think there is this problem of going from the personal to the general and looking carefully at the data that's actually emerging. I've had a problem throughout my writing career in getting anyone to publish stories like this. I have to pick if I want to write about this sort of topic, I can think of about 2 or 3 editors in the country who will be interested in me writing it. I can't get on to programs in the ABC in particular. I have had wonderful examples in my past of people I know working in the ABC telling me that they thought of me for a particular problem, but because there was a single mother who was a producer on that show, they wouldn't have a bar of me. So that's a really interesting question. I wonder if we went through the ABC, how many researchers, producers, people working there would actually be in traditional families, as opposed to single-parent families or living in de facto relationships, like, of course, Richard Glover, who's always taking me on over this issue. So that there is this enormous resistance to discussion around these issues. I suppose the classic for me was when I wrote a few years ago about when Julia Gillard had just been made Prime Minister, and the discussion was emerging about whether she was going to move into the lodge with Tim. And I wrote about the whole question of a role model in a cohabiting relationship, and suggested there were problems for women in having this, what was then an extremely well-regarded woman, living in that situation. And 2 main things I talked about. One was the impact on children of being born into unstable relationships. But I also talked about something I'm sure you all know about, which is the number of women who spend many years in de facto relationships where that's the whole point about de facto relationships. The expectations often aren't clearly set out at the start of relationships. They very often don't have a discussion about where this is leading. In fact, women have often said to me, I don't dare raise that. I'll raise that a bit further down the track, whether he really is interested in having children, whether he's really interested in this being a long-term relationship. And then 2 or 3 years down the track, it turns out he wasn't interested. He was just happy staying where he was. For 3 years with this man, 4 years with that man, she's suddenly 40 and she's missed out on her chances of having children. And I'm sure everyone in this room knows people like that. And that is a very big story. Well, when I wrote about this, all hell broke loose. I have never had such venom. Put your head in the oven, you old bag, was the classic comment on one of the newspaper columns. And then it was interesting, a few years after that, or a year or so after that, a man called David Laser, who you may know, very well-respected journalist, if he ever wants to interview you, say no. He came to do a profile on me and theory on men and sex, but as it turned out, he wanted to have a go at me about the whole cohabitation issue. And he took me on. I mean, I said I'll send him all the research. I did send through all the references to him. And then he turned around to me and said, I don't believe in social science research. You can prove anything with that. He wrote up this it was Women's Weekly article saying how I was seething about this issue and never mentioned the fact that I was seething because I was confronted by the journalist who said he didn't believe in social science research. What do you do with that? The man lives in Byron Bay, which may not surprise you. And it's interesting for me that even leaders who used to be very comfortable talking about these issues have now been silenced. And the classic is the clergy. I, a few years ago, wrote about Pat Rafter, tennis player, who was appointed Australian of the Year. I don't know whether you remember that. It was a fascinating story because they suddenly discovered, just as he'd been appointed, that he had a girlfriend who just got pregnant. And it was a really interesting story. I watched it avidly to see whether the M word was ever mentioned. And no one raised it at all in the media. And then finally he was on a talkback radio program and a little girl rang in, talk about Emperor's New Clothes, and said, was he planning to get married to his girlfriend? And I talked to the producer of this program and he said, no one cares about that sort of stuff anymore, And it was one little girl who actually raised the question. And to me, it was a really interesting issue because if you have, the whole question of parental responsibility and paternal responsibility and trying to get men to take responsibility for their children and to engage in looking after those children, what message does it send if the Australian of the Year is in a situation where we don't even know and we don't dare ask whether he has any plans to remain involved in that family? I mean, I don't imagine. It's supposed to be a really nice bloke. I wasn't suggesting he was likely to walk out on that family, but it's the fact that we can't even talk about this that drives me crazy. And I had a letter from a clergyman saying, I wouldn't dream of raising this issue when I'm preaching to the congregation. We don't dare offend anybody anymore. But of course, part of the issue is there are a lot of people in all sorts of families doing a really good job at raising their children, and we're so nervous of offending them by suggesting there are other patterns emerging here. And what I suppose really bugs me is we're still really comfortable going overseas to developing countries and telling women that it's absolutely in their interest to have Planned Parenthood. I'm not talking about using contraception, I'm talking about, for that woman's sake, making good decisions about whether to have children or not, or when to have them, and whether they can afford to raise them. And for the sake of those children, to only have them when you're able to support them and look after them properly. How is it we can't talk about that here? How is it we're heading for a situation where increasing numbers of children are born into these very casual relationships? Now, just briefly, I wanted to say something about the work you're going to hear about from Jeremy about sexual abuse. In my latest fascinating career, which is dating coaching, and if you want to find out more about that, you can read a little leaflet outside. One of the things that's really intrigued me is hearing from men. There's a lot of sex going on in dating relationships these days, and hearing from men about how easily they are invited into the homes of single mums where the children are fast asleep, children of all ages. And here is this new date, invited for a sleepover with children in the next room. I mean, it just blows me away, the risks people have in doing that. And when you think about that, you've got these new relationships, which we all know, judgment goes out the window. When you're first in love, the psychologists call this phase limerence. And it's notorious, that phase, for poor judgment, for only looking for the good in the person you've fallen in love with, for not being capable of making proper evaluative assessment about their character. And this is a really dangerous state in which to be making judgments about your children and about whether the men should be invited into your children's lives. And where I've particularly come across this is many years I spent writing about family law, and I had so many incredibly distressed fathers, biological fathers, coming to me saying they knew their children were at risk. They had evidence of their children being abused by mum's boyfriend. And they would go to docs, they would yell and scream trying to do something about it, and they were treated like total jealous crackpots. And I mean, can you imagine what that's like? And it strikes me as really odd that we're in this situation where dads often really have to struggle to maintain contact with their children, while strangers can go in willy-nilly and have unlimited access to the children in these very vulnerable families. Thank you.